So welcome everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our closing session called Synthesis. For those of you who are just tuning in and haven't watched all of these great videos, we are going to synthesize them for you here. Those of you who have engaged with us for the last couple of days, you're going to see we are trying to make sense of all of this content for you to answer some really big questions and help you move forward to build back better, to build your organizations, whether it is rebooting your entire business or engaging your organizations. We are helping you get better by design and hoping to give you some real powerful discussions and insights here. We have a terrific panel, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just a minute. But before that, a couple technical notes. So if you've been through this for the last couple of days, then you know there is an expandable window to your right, and you will move that over and ask any question you like. We're going to touch on those questions at about minute 45, but you can start asking those questions whenever you want. Our folks will be stimulating you with all kinds of discussion points, and at any point in that conversation, you have a question, just plug it in and we'll get to it. The other last discussion on technical issues is a poll at the end. We're going to give you 5 minutes to do that poll. So other than the questions and the poll, just be here and embrace the lessons of our colleagues. So I'm going to have you quickly introduce yourselves. John, why don't you start first?
I'm John Romeo. I lead the Oliver Wyman Forum at Oliver Wyman.
And Lewis?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lewis Garrett, and I lead the Employee Experience and Engagement practice at Mercer for our international region. We spend a lot of time studying people at work, so it gives me loads of data about people's experiences. And I'm a passionate author, so end up writing up a lot of what we find out. It's things like the Harvard Business Review and these sorts of publications. So really pleased to be here. Thanks, Gordon.
Thrilled to have you. And Charlie?
Hi, I'm Charlie Neberton. I lead Marsh Advisory for the UK and Ireland. That's all of our consulting solutions, our analytics solutions, and our claim solutions for our clients.
And Joan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Joan Collar. I'm the Mercer Marsh Benefits Asia Regional Leader based in Singapore. I'm very passionate about healthcare and really excited to be here to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Joan. Thrilled to have you. And finally, Kai.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Kai Anderson. I'm a Mercer partner. My area of responsibility is that of what we call business transformation. So I'm dealing a lot with cultural transformation, organizational transformation, and right now, of course, the transformation of work, of the workforce.
So this is our crew making sense of all of this material for you that we've discussed over the last couple of days. And I'm just going to start and give you each couple minutes, 2 minutes. And if it goes longer, that's fine. We're going to ask you the big question to begin, which is what stood out? What were the big takeaways? What was surprising? What was provocative? And we will find from there some threads that tie this together. And we're just figuring this out together, folks. Those of you who are watching live, this is a live discussion. We have not rehearsed this. We don't know where this is going to go. And with that, why don't we start with you, Lewis?
Yeah, great. So, I was looking at the empowering our people topic, and I think there are a few meta themes that I took away. The first is that we have completely outdated leadership archetypes in many organizations. The way that we think about leadership just is not really tied to what great leadership really is. It's too misogynistic. It's too bold. It just doesn't contain some of the core components that get great outcomes from our people. So leadership is in the eyes of followers, and we spent many years studying leaders as exceptional human beings and perhaps being led down the wrong path. So that really stood out to me. The second is perhaps the rediscovery of ignorance. Ignorance in the sense that, from the Latin, we do not know. And the importance of admitting that perhaps we do not know, and that in order to be able to truly learn, we have to admit that we're starting from a place of ignorance, but that we have the power, the tools, the curiosity to find out what's really going on if we apply ourselves in the right way. The third thing I think I learned is that it's important to be courageous rather than confident. I mean, confidence, I think so many of us might read self-help books, see them on the stand in the airport when that used to happen. But, you know, that perhaps is leading us down the wrong path. And, you know, confident people might overcommit themselves. Courageous people know their limits, but are willing to try anyway. And I think there's some important messages there. And then last, I think, you know, one of the sort of things that stood out to me is the importance of being a learn-it-all and not a know-it-all. This is, you know, the famous quote from Satya Nadella. And, you know, data-driven leadership, when I listened to so many of the talks, I really heard this, well, the data tells us this and the data tells us that. And what did we learn from that? And what insight does that give us? So an effort to really try to understand the world through objective means, I think, has really come into the fore, particularly from people leadership perspective. So some really fascinating insights, Gordon, and I really enjoyed listening to all of the great speakers.
And as we unpack that, and we're going to do this a bit more after everyone speaks, but when you say the word ignorance, in the US, we might hear that in a very negative way, but I'm hearing it from you as sort of beginner's mind. Am I hearing that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is a provocative word, which is why I used it. You know, the Latin ignoramus means we do not know. And I think it's that the acceptance of, you know, our naivety, if you would rather put it in a more sort of maybe diplomatic way, that gives us then the power to start to say, well, then I should find out. It sort of rebases us around a set of principles that I think are very important, particularly for people who are used to telling other people what to do, you know, who are used to having the answers. And, you know, I think we really see this come out in some of the topics around the more feminine leadership styles that we've seen really getting results. So I think there's some real lessons to be learned from that.
Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to go to you next, Joan. We're staying on sort of the human side of our 5 theme areas. So when we're dealing with empowering people and talking about health, and those are highly related. So why don't you pick it up on the health topic?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. And again, really delighted to be here. I spent some time talking to a number of people and also going through some of the videos around prioritizing our health. And one of the key things that sort of jumped out was really about redefining that health proposition. What does health and wellness mean? And again, the COVID crisis, and I know that theme or that phrase was used quite a bit, was it is a shame to waste a crisis, and talked about vulnerability. We found that a lot of the leaders, a lot of the organizations, when they first went into the pandemic mode, it was all about providing basic protection, basic coverage to people who might be affected. And that was the immediate go-to mode, right? But as the pandemic has panned out and obviously dragged on, you're starting to have these leaders not really knowing where the future is going to lie. And you're starting to see and hear a lot of leaders talk about burnout, talk about Zoom fatigue, you know, mental health, which has, you know, really rose up into the forefront, and having a lot of leaders being very vulnerable, saying that, you know, I'm also tired and I also need a break. And it's really struck me, particularly around that whole vulnerability and authenticity of leaders actually identifying, you know, with this great level of vulnerability, and really makes, you know, these organizations rethink about health and wellness. And I mentioned in some of these conversations about flipping the triangle a little bit, right? I think Lorna in one of the panels has spoke about, you know, had touched about, you know, accessibility, affordability, accountability. And you find that very much an Asian versus a Western mindset as well around, you know, the delivery of healthcare. I think one of the great things about the pandemic, it has really amplified, you know, in terms of the disparity of healthcare delivery. And one of the positive aspects of this, you know, Gordon, is how acceleration of technology, you know, with regards to things like telehealth, adoption of, you know, I think Lewis was saying about, you know, not knowing anything, but they're willing to try. And so I've seen a lot of great organizations just try a little bit something new in order to try and hopefully make a difference, you know, in the health and well-being, and particularly around embracing digital health solutions. So that's been quite phenomenal and revolutionary for me.
I'm already seeing the thread. So after we go through the full round, round of 5. We're going to discuss what the threads are, some interesting connections already, and to make it a little bit easier since you're sort of teeing it up, why don't we go to you next, Kai? So when we're talking about embracing digital and new ways of thinking of applying technology, what were the standout issues and moments for you?
Happy to, Gordon. We were talking a lot about, is the crisis a threat or is it a kind of teacher? And there's things the crisis told us, which is, of course, first thing to me, everything is global. The virus could only spread in a completely globalized world. And that was showing us the vulnerability of our entire system, the complexity of our supply chains. But on the other hand, it also showed us the resilience. Looking at the speed, that many companies came up with in coping with the crisis, that was fantastic. Within days, organizations were switching to remote work, 100%. So that's showing the potential of human creativity on the one hand, and the power of the digital tools we could use. But the crisis also put things into the right order. Technology didn't save us. It wasn't AI that saved us. It was human creativity, empowered, amplified by digital technology. And here's the good message. We can cope with any kind of crisis, and let us not pretend that we can really foresee this kind of events. But we have the ability, we have the creativity, the technology to really cope with this kind of crisis. So that was quite outstanding, and I saw a lot of participants really emphasizing this. And by that, of course, the crisis has been accelerating what we call digital transformation, which is, to me, I'm a people kind of person, which is first a cultural kind of thing, and that was, to me, outstanding, because we are talking about today, we are talking about a characteristic that has long been unknown for leaders in organizations, which is empathy. In the crisis, we were showing empathy because, it was about safety of people first. It was, as Joan said, it was about, staying healthy, which is great stuff, I think. And there's maybe one more thing, which was, quite a, I wouldn't say shock event for me, but it's a big question, and it is, does technology and what we encounter here, does that create more humanity and equality, or does it broaden the gap in our organizations and in society? And Vivian Ming put that into a phrase which I really remember, is when she said, "Do you want to be part of a creative economy or part of the low-skilled service economy?" And when I heard that, I said, "Wow, what a phrase, and that summarizes a lot." I don't have an answer to that, but better by design is bringing up the right questions, and here's a question I have, and I'm happy to discuss. So great stuff.
Again, many things to dive into here, and a pattern emerging. John, why don't you pick up and how this impacts the resilient business efforts that you heard about and that you're seeing in our organization? What were the big takeaways for you?
Thanks, Gordon. I mean, it's been a fascinating couple of days, and maybe just to link back to Lewis's comment on ignorance, from my perspective, this one has raised many more questions than answers around this topic. I guess I'd start with the geopolitical backdrop. Is important to set the context for how we're thinking about a lot of this stuff, and that came through in a few of the conversations. Sometimes it's overly simplified, but I think there's no doubt the rise of China means there's less resilience overall, and indeed this has been a spur for much of the increased regionalization we've seen the last 10 years. Parag talked about North America being close to self-sufficiency, all roads in Asia not leading just to China, but it being a multipolar region and indeed world. And I think that it's important to understand that when we then think about the response to the crisis. And I think we've talked a lot about COVID being an accelerant, not a spark, around concerns over inequality, healthcare, some of the undesirable effects of globalization, and those risks had been around and building for years, but they just got aggravated by the crisis. And interestingly, I think it's left political and business leaders left with no choice but to address them. And so you start to see things like the digital divide, right, brought into much sharper focus. We hear a lot of positive stories of companies that were switched to work from home at scale very, very quickly, much more quickly than thought was possible. But you hear less, I'm sitting in London, you hear less about the 17 million people in the UK who don't have the 5 essential digital skills for life, right? And that raises, it's a big question. In a world with rising inequality, particularly in wealthy countries, does the technology that Kai was just touching on, does that create these virtual walls that allow us to tolerate inequality in a way that could create some instability going forward? So I think there's a set of questions there. We've also seen a gap, and a lot of talk on this, a gap in between global challenges and global response. Climate is an obvious example that needs a global response. And it's escalated in terms of importance in recent years. Yet we couldn't manage a global response to the COVID pandemic without some countries putting protectionist measures on PPE. So what does that mean when we're going to have climate that has an imbalanced effect across the world? And then you get this vacuum. Like there's a lot of push for business to step into that hole and take on some of those wider social aims, and certainly businesses are being evaluated in a different way to before, whether that's from their customers, investor pressure, regulation, government conditionality, whatever it is. And it's putting big expectations on our leaders on all fronts. And you often hear it's never been harder to lead a company, but it's never been easier to blame the external environment for that. And I don't think we can quite let everyone off the hook, but leaders are going to have to respond differently. And it raises interesting questions again around how the world operates. In history, it's been 60-year-old white men that have thought about how the world should be run based on their education and beliefs. But the world's changed dramatically in the past 20 years, and the decision makers haven't. So how big a problem for us is that? And so I keep coming away with more questions. I guess the one last thing I'd say, and it's really been along the sides of the event that I've been hearing from a lot of the business participants, is that the crisis revealed they had made a whole series of compromises on their business models in recent years. And during this crisis, the most noticeable change has been a bias to action. And the biggest concern we're hearing from them now is, how do we make sure we don't lose that and settle back into the old behaviors? So how do we keep that mentality and bias for action?
So hopefully you folks are taking some notes, because there's so many interesting little nuggets here to start connecting because they are either commonalities or absolute distinctions. We have things that we're exposing here that is the light and the shadow. So we want to explore both sides. And I think Vivian Ming said this really well, right? Is AI going to save us, or is it going to kill us, right? And, you have to sort of embrace two truths. You have to sort of live with both of those things. So, whether we are having to solve big global problems or we are becoming more nationalistic. So I want to explore these two sides as they're either coming together or moving apart. And with that, let's talk about risk, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So a few things have really stood out to me over the last couple of days, but I may want to start with Mike Poulos's point about looking at likelihood and severity separately. We so often conflate those two things. And a number of people have made similar points. It's very easy to focus on the on the big 10 risks, the things that we think are going to happen tomorrow. And I think we need to maybe reflect what's happened in our corporate cultures that have enabled this to happen. John was maybe heading in this direction just a moment ago, but if we think about it, as a corporate leader, if you don't manage the risks that everyone thinks are going to happen, the potential penalty for that is very, very high. Whereas if you miss the tail event, because everyone missed the tail event, then it's seemingly not such a bad thing. But if we build that out across all of our corporations, all of our organizations around the world, then you've got everyone focusing on the things that everyone thinks is going to happen, and no one really worrying about the things that maybe aren't so likely to happen. And I think that causes a massive amount of risk of major shock to the global economy. So that's the first thing I think that's really come out of this. The second is this sense of needing to sort of balance traditional views of risk management, which is all very, very, very centric, very, very focused to a sort of risk management organization, with this concept of sort of distributed and diverse computing power of your colleagues around the world. How do you actually reach out and bring all of that in? And it's easy to talk about, and you can have initiatives of outreach, of engaging with colleagues around the world. But how many organizations have really thought about how to create the psychological safety that enables that to survive? The entry conditions for that sort of mindset are actually quite challenging to achieve. And I think that really merits further discussion, which sort of leads me on to my final big takeaway, which is how to balance organizational agility with resilience. Again, John was talking just now about some of the trade-offs that organizations have made, that in order to further refine margins, we've maybe weakened our supply chains, we've removed layers of resilience, either consciously or just because that seemed like an opportunity for so-called efficiency. So we keep making these trade-offs, but at some point we have to return to some semblance of balance. And so for me, the third big takeaway from here, the big theme would be balance.
So I'm going to pass this around a bit, but I can't help myself. You know, it's so interesting that the notions coming out of risk are, Lewis, what I would imagine you'd be talking about here. You know, psychological safety and, you know, balance, and, you know, you're talking about beginner's mind and outdated models of leadership, but that's in the empowering our people topic. So how are these two related? And I know Mike made a really important point that, you know, we had greater response and more strength in the capabilities coming back from countries that have dealt with this before. It was in their experience set. For those of us living in the US, this is outside of our experience set. We have sort of biases that keep us optimistic or inherently unable at some level to sort of grok that. So you have to have different people around the table. But again, this seems to be like a people issue or a risk issue. How are these things tied together, Lewis?
Well, I mean, so look, everything is a leadership issue. And I think what we're seeing here is that the leadership mindset creates the boundaries through which all of these other things start to flow. And you could argue that because everything is a leadership issue, it is always a people issue. You know, a leader doesn't exist, you know, doesn't have the position of leader unless there are people connected to that person, unless there are followers. And I think what we're hearing here is the importance of building a culture and mindset that really helps people make decisions in a more effective way, closer to where they need to be made. And you know, risk, I love that concept of distributed, you know, risk. You know, how do we manage that in a less central, more distributed way, where we're helping people make smarter, better decisions everywhere? And you know, the internet is an incredible tool, you know, resource for doing that, but no, sort of bringing that alive. And I think the other thing that's very meaningful and important here, just to go back to my point about ignorance, is that, you know, the internet as a tool can make you more ignorant or less ignorant. It's almost your choice. You can hear what you want to hear there and feel emboldened and empowered with your own perspective, or you can reach out and search for other points of view. And I think that's kind of what's built into risk management. It's like, well, what are all the potential possibilities here? You know, we've heard about likelihood, but also severity. And in what way can we learn about those in ways perhaps we hadn't thought of before, by, you know, empowering a group of people to use these distributed technologies more effectively? So I think it's incredible to see those connections and realize that this all boils down to how leaders show up every day and how they think about the problems that they take responsibility for.
If I might just add to that, sorry, Gordon, but I mean, I was quite taken with Francesca's point about the pirate ship, the pirate captain, and the fact that the crew can actually overthrow the pirate captain. And what I liked about that point was the fact that if you embrace curiosity, if you're going to be the leader, and if the fact that people can overthrow you, right, you very quickly adopt to what Lewis has said, a curious or a learning or a growth mindset, and that really opens up your mind in terms of the art of the possible, right? And I think in certain industries and in certain organizations, particularly, and I'm going to lean in from an Asian perspective, Asian organizations look to the boss to decide, right? They know better. The CEO knows better. I mean, Lewis and I are both based in Singapore. We've seen this in droves, right? And to some extent, I think to Mike's point, in certain aspects, yes, that might have led us to, like, for example, they experienced SARS and all that, and there is a certain degree of that familiarity in terms of addressing the human need, addressing the medical need. But as the pandemic has dragged on, clearly these leaders who are in there have never faced this particular problem before. And the fact that this whole work from home fatigue aspects and whatnot, people are now embracing the voice of the employees, the voice of the population, because they do realize that crowdsourcing of this ideas and creativity, is really going to help to transform, whether it's leadership or whether it's benefit programs or healthcare transformation. That's what's really going to drive, true transformation. And so I think that, there is, you're right, there is a threat, there is a theme, but, again, that disseminated information in the hands of the employees. But if they have that curious mindset and that curiosity, the ambition to learn, that will drive that forward. And leaders will have to, will have no choice but to listen.
Yeah, and just to build on that, Joan, I mean, the thing that hadn't come up yet, but I think is important is, Ryan said something really powerful, which was that, it's time to have those difficult conversations. Yeah. And she was using it in the context of, talking about race and inequality and some of the topics that she is personally accountable for and interested in. But we could spread that, we all have to have more difficult conversations so that we can learn more effectively. And I think there's so much we can learn, perhaps in tackling these issues about what am I really ignorant about that perhaps I hadn't put enough attention to, that would open up all of these issues in a much more meaningful way.
So John wanted to jump in, but Kai first. Kai, then John, and then we're going to pick up the threads. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have to maybe object to a certain extent. I mean, Luis, I agree with you. Everything is a leadership issue. And I also admit that, especially in a crisis, we all tend to look up to the leaders. But I think we have to get across that point. Charlie was talking about psychological safety. Leadership is crucial for that kind of psychological safety, but it starts on the very individual level, and the old leaders versus employees doesn't work anymore in creating psychological safety. It starts with a very individual within an organization. And if we don't come to a point where people acknowledge a few things, not only leaders, but every individual within the organization, the unpredictability, the complexity, all of these things, and find their own psychological safety and balance, if we don't manage to get across that, we'll be doomed, I guess.
So we'll talk about the role of leaders to create those conditions to allow for that safety to flourish. But why don't we go to John, and then we'll pick up these threads, because the human issues here, we'll just call them human issues, employee issues, leadership issues, board issues, decision-making issues about how we work together to come to these conclusions. This is all up for grabs here. There's many threads that tie that together. John, why don't you pick up on this point of how is this guiding us towards resiliency or not?
Well, I think it links back to Lewis's original point, because what's a little bit different here is just the multidimensional nature of the change. There's so much happening at once. You've got new expectations from customers, from employees, a new economic reality. And interestingly, the one thing that's been stable throughout that have been the megatrend. But from an organization level, one of the things we've seen is that, and it links to the psychological safety to a degree, but the alignment more is that purpose is more important than ever. The tactics and the strategies locally are changing. But what one of the CEOs recently said, solidarity has proven more contagious than the virus itself. And I think that's sort of the right kind of mindset. If you can be absolutely clear as leaders on what the purpose is, then it gives you all sorts of flexibility in terms of that leadership style, how you take decisions, et cetera, because everyone's working to the same playbook.
So let me do something here. I've written a handful of meta takeaways. You're describing meta takeaways, and I'm getting meta here, and that sounds sort of like a weird abstraction, but really what we're looking at is the big questions that overlay to the insights that are consistent across these topics. So I want to read some of these out to you because you talk to many of them here. Authenticity, vulnerability, outdated archetypes, courage, beginner's mind, empathy, and rethinking about who is running the world here. Is it the 60-year-old white men that should be continuing to set policy, because that's not representative anymore? So a lot of things are outdated, and we have this moment to reflect. So here I'm going to lay out for you 5 reflections that capture a lot of what we as a design team heard over the last couple of days. And when I say heard over the last couple of days, just a quick reminder, we had 1,700 people having these conversations. We had 14 live sessions with phenomenal speakers, 1,500 plus people watching these videos and engaging in polls around these videos, 16 on-demand talks. I mean, incredibly rich discussion over dozens of design sessions where we were working together on these topics. So all of the material here I'm going to read out is a culmination of that, and I want to get your response. But give me a minute to sort of lay this out for you. So number 1, this idea of acceleration. We heard acceleration is happening. We heard it in almost every talk. But we want to make sure, and this is my point with number 1, that if acceleration is happening, the question is, how do we make sure that we're applying really deep personal and organizational awareness to make sure that we're accelerating the right things? We talk about, we don't want to waste a crisis. Adam Grant talked about, this is time for thinking deep and slow versus shallow and fast. But we're seeing sometimes in organizations, as you described many times, like wonderful things that are happening, decentralized creativity, autonomous decision-making, all of these ways of meeting our customers' needs faster than ever. But we're also sometimes seeing protectionism, scarcity, fear-based reactions, which are normal right now, but we have to understand what are we actually seeing in the organization, and how do we help leaders if we say that many of these, if not all of these, are leadership issues? How do they figure out what actually matters most? What are the things that we truly want to accelerate? And are we aware of those customer insights, those operational challenges, the go-forward models, approaches, and what we need to do as leaders? So question number 1, I want you to think about, and I want to introduce some responses to these. These are hard questions, existential questions that we need to hold, but your responses to these. So that's question number 1, is how do we make sure that we have the deep awareness that the acceleration that's happening is the acceleration that's leading us where we want to go? Question number 2, big question. This is more of a mindset question than a framing context question. On this mindset piece, how do we actually connect with and energize people to solve these profoundly difficult problems? To Kai's point, we need psychological safety at the individual level. The decision-making and the creativity is distributed. But how do we actually energize people? And we're finding that empathy, as you're describing, is really important. Listening, authenticity, deeper conversations, what we've seen and experienced as traditionally feminine leadership qualities. Well, we've seen the data. The women leaders, the country leaders have done better than the men, hands down. So what is it about that? I want you to help us answer the question, how are women mobilizing people more effectively and embracing humanity in a way that we can learn from? And even in this situation here, in your homes or in your offices, we have the opportunity to be connected in a more authentic way rather than be separate. So let's talk about how do we hold those light and shadow elements, but lean into the most positive. Number 3, if you're tracking here, I'm going to move kind of quickly. This one's a bit more of a neurological issue, which I found to be fascinating and consistent across our themes. How do we bypass this cognitive block that we have that prevents us to take the actions necessary to face the inevitable? And as Mike Poulos described, and in the crisis conversation in climate, we heard this as well. Things are staring us in the face. We heard the story that the Central Valley floods every 150 to 200 years. We're at 160 years or so since the last flood, and what are we doing? So this idea of the frequency and gravity of these events that we're not comprehending or not processing or not dealing with in the appropriate ways. And it's a failure of imagination, as we've heard. So what is this limited response that we're seeing? And we talked about Asia versus the US because they have it in their experience. So how do we get more people around the table? I mean, this is the big question that we've been asking our clients for years. So this is not new, right? You need to hear more voices. You need to, have a multidisciplinary conversation. You need to invite customers in. Zach Bush talked about bringing artists in. That's great, but what is going to make us do it this time? Number 4, the other thing that was so fascinating and consistent everywhere and showed up in a lot of what you had to say is we're dealing with paradox. But the question I'm asking you is, how do we use paradox to our strategic advantage? Again, Dr. Ming's example. Is it going to kill us? Is it going to save us? We have to hold both. We have to, by our board's demands, drive efficiency and cost because we're coming out of a crisis. But at the same time, we need to invest more in redundancy and resiliency. In some ways, we need to have more control because we've been out of control, but in otherwise, we need to lean into not having control and democratize even further and allow for more autonomy. So these trade-offs have become more visible. But do we know how to process these trade-offs? Are we bringing in the right people to have the right kinds of conversations like Royan's asking us to do? So the 5th one's sort of a punchline question, which again, Dr. Ming gave us this insight of, at the end of the day, we don't know what the jobs are going to be in the future. We don't know what skills we need to hire for. What we do know that we need to do is learn and learn faster and have this meta learning about how we learn, have even more pace to it, and just do it better, right? So if we think about Queen Rania's story, this is just such an elegant little piece with her little puppy running around on the session, that she didn't see herself as a dog person. And that's been a limiting belief. She has this dog now. It's her greatest companion. She's adoring this dog. And it was a sweet little story, but it's profound in its insight that we have these self-limiting beliefs and these definitions that hold us back. And it might be at an organizational level as well. You might think that you are in the software business, but you're actually in the business of accelerating the insights of your clients. So how do you define yourself that's holding you back? So a lot of what I'm seeing as this 5th one wraps up is this idea of letting go. As Zach Bush talks about, even wellness being about surrender, that we're regenerating all the time. Our cells are regenerating. We have the ability to be a new human every couple of milliseconds if we actually look at ourselves at a cellular level. But this is true at a macrocosmic level as well. How do we actually regenerate? So these are big questions, folks. And I want to ask you to start diving into these themes and questions. And let's take any one that you want to start with. Lewis, you're smiling, so I'm going to start with
you. Because I was like, I have lots of other questions. But okay, so I'll start with the thing I wrote down. And then, we'll see what other people say. So the neurological block you talked about, why isn't it people don't do obvious things and sort of tackle those things head on? I mean, to some extent, I think this is what we have institutions for, as in, to err is human, and, to overcome some of the things that are built into us, we build systems, structures, institutions around us to try and help us make better decisions to grow more successful societies. So this is where trust in institutions becomes important. You can't have that influence on individuals unless they trust the advice that they're getting, unless there is that. Trust is the currency of relationships. In fact, it's why money was invented, to move trust around. And so, I feel that is a very important point, because I think sometimes the reason people don't make good decisions because they don't trust in the information they're hearing, or or the systems that have been built to protect them or help them. And I think that is an important thread that we all see showing up in many of the things that have been shared.
Incredibly important thread. Go for it.
Can I pick up on Lewis's point just there? Because actually, I was going to jump straight in on neurology too. So it's kind of interesting that that's where you went to first, Lewis. And there were two things that have really jumped out for me about this. The first is, you made this point about institutions. Institutions, are there to make us safe. They create sort of they create a sort of institutional security, and I agree with that, right? I think that is definitely part of their nature, but I think they can also make us complacent. You have, I'm a risk guy, so everyone should have a risk register. So that's great. So go and write down all of your risks and think really hard about them, and then put that risk register in a drawer. And maybe don't think about it for a while. And then when something bad happens, go, oh yeah, look, hey, it was on my risk register. But that hasn't actually necessarily made you any safer or any better prepared to deal with this. When the pandemic struck, we pulled up the UK government's risk register, and there was, on the top 10 was pandemic. And then you've got, rundown stocks of PPE. So how do you balance those two things? How have you gone through part of that exercise, but then not completed it? And that for me is it is part of this paradox that Gordon was talking about earlier. I'm just not sure how you balance that.
Well, I mean, we didn't talk about competence, Charlie. So, it's like, well, I wrote it down, but I didn't do anything. It's like, well, you actually have to take it serious. Like, you have to actually be a good institution. But, I feel we could have an entire hour just on competence in general. So, yes. But I think that's what you're saying.
One of those things that ladders up, right? We don't do trust. We get trust because we've done, as you say, the empathy, the authenticity, the listening, and so forth. Kai, pick up on that.
Yeah, but trust is definitely an effect we need in order to create that resilience throughout the entire organization. And there is one way in at least getting there, and that is communication. It's as easy as that. And Louis, best, when we do employee surveys, what's always on top of the list? It's leadership first, and it's communication second. So people are never satisfied with the degree of communications in an organization. If we, and you ask, Gordon, you ask for, how can we accelerate that? We need to accelerate dialogue. We need to accelerate exchange in an organization, because that creates transparency, that creates trust.
Yeah, I love it's some great science.
I just wanted to hold that.
Yeah, go on, Gordon.
No, well, I just wanted to highlight that we're now summarizing the summary. And I think Kai said something really lovely. How do we accelerate, if we're going to accelerate something, the dialogue and the transparency? Because we're thinking about accelerating all kinds of pragmatic things, structural things, process things. But you lifted it up to another level. Dialogue and transparency hold a lot of the things that you've described earlier, right? So pick up on that. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Lewis.
Oh, no, sorry. I think I love the topic of trust. I think it's a very important, meaningful, and interesting topic. There's a lot of research about it, and I mentioned competence earlier, and I think one of the ways we build trust is through competence. Although I think some of us can point to situations where clearly someone's being incompetent, and that's kind of part of the issue. It's like, well, should we trust that person? Maybe not. The thing that I was going to ask you, Gordon, is that, you talked about acceleration and how do we make sure we're accelerating to where we want to be. And part of me was wondering, actually, do we have a choice? I guess, I read a wonderful book by a chap called Kevin Kelly called The Inevitable. Have you read it? Yeah, it's a wonderful book where he talks about the 12 influences that technology will have on our life. And this is happening. And so I wondered if we felt that actually we're on this train and what we've got to do is innovate fast enough to keep ahead of where we're going. And, do you think, how much control do we actually have over some of these trends? Because it's not like, the internet is here and it's changed everything and you can't now rein it in. No one's controlling the internet quite clearly. So, to what extent is this can we actually control this acceleration? Is it even possible? Or should we just be trying to figure out where it's going and do the thing that beings do and adapt to that direction? I'm curious as to your.
I'm just going to throw out a contradicting point in there, Lewis. Right? I mean, I hear what you're saying, but then we talked about paradox earlier, and you talked about cost efficiency and manage the P&L, right? But when do you have organizations literally walking the talk in terms of, yeah, I believe in all of that, and I'm going to commit to that. I'm going to put some money and some resources, to explore that theme, to explore the theme about competency, to explore the theme about acceleration, to explore the theme about, empowerment, trusted shared vision, leaderships, and so on. So you also have that paradox to Gordon's point earlier about organizations believing in that sufficiently to put the muscle, to put the commitment, to put the dollars in terms of literally going down that route. Now, I agree. In certain areas, you don't have a choice anymore. Whether you want it or not, you're going to be dragged there by, the bullhorns, and get to that stage. But you also have that, complexity or that paradox where organizations don't believe that they're going to effectively invest in these areas. We talk about people, we talk about outdated leadership styles, we talk about outdated plan designs, for example, right? People who get higher and higher up in the hierarchy get better perks, get better benefits. People who truly deserve it, who don't really have that affordability or equality or accessibility, can't afford it because of the paradox shift. So you're still going to have that aspect whereby organizations still need to meet the P&L, right? Because the shareholders demand it. So how do you solve for that? I mean, I don't have a question. I don't have the answer for that, but that is the complexity and the paradox that we're living in this world.
I think I agree with Joan's point. I think it's a really interesting one. We can certainly point to plenty of shortcomings in competency in all sorts of areas across the crisis, but the decisions at the time were very difficult. I mean, 10, 20, $30 billion spending on some of the contingency on the vaccines now seems cheap now, but a year or so ago versus some of the other priorities, it was a challenging decision. I think what's happened is this crisis has been a wake-up call. And maybe to go back to your point, Lewis and Kevin Kelly, I certainly don't believe the future is predetermined. I think many of those trends are, but I think we've been given through this a glimpse at what can happen in a number of directions. And it's still very much ours to shape and design, an opportunity to reimagine. And I think one of the things that's characterized this crisis, you look at the companies that have done best so far, they've been characterized by a speed of decision making at a pace that they didn't think was possible before. I think as we look forward, the most resilient corporations and probably the most successful ones that find success in the future are going to be those that can continue to turn on a dime as nimbly as they have during the pandemic.
Let me jump in with a question from the audience. And I'm gonna tee this up right off of where you were describing, John, and I got this metaphor from you a month or two ago, so I'm going to take no credit for it. But this idea that the world is lava, right? And it's in molten shape right now, and it's hot and it's moldable, and it's not going to be for much longer. And once it solidifies, the question is, and it came from one of our viewers right here, is how do we make this stuff stick? I mean, if we have this openness right now, if we have this curiosity right now, if we're holding paradox in interesting ways right now, because we sort of have to, right? This is just the world that we're in. That's what the context sets up. But when the lava cools and it's all calcified, so it's a question that I think this viewer cares about, we care about deeply, right? We want to do the best for our clients across MMC, and we want our viewers who are listening right here to not only make these changes right now or have these moments of awakening and enlightenment right now, but when it all cools down and calcifies, how do we make sure this stuff sticks? So we only have about 6 minutes left before we start the polls. What counsel do you have? Now, we don't have all the answers here, but how do we help our clients make the changes happen now, but make sure that they sustain themselves when it's no longer a crisis? Who wants to start that one?
Can I maybe have a quick go at that first, Gordon? For me, one of the big things that we've got to we've got to find a way to move on from is this this success bias that has dictated sort of the way that we've looked at the world for the last 100 or so years, right? We look at what was successful, and we do it in all aspects of life, right? We do it in investing, we do it in corporate leadership, we do it in, if you look at sort of social media trends, we look backwards at what's worked, and we say, if we do that thing, if we emulate that, surely we will have the same success. And what we fail to realize is that for all the people who did similar things, maybe many of them were unsuccessful at doing it. And so just because it did work doesn't mean that it will work going forwards. And if we can find a way to break out of that mindset in this crisis, we actually have a chance of adding some direction to the acceleration that you were talking about earlier.
Okay, with 5 minutes left, I want everyone to respond to this question. Let's just move around this particular challenge, because it is sort of the meta challenge here. We have all kinds of insights that we're gleaning from all of our speakers that you've been researching and we've been counseling on. But here's the moment here. How do we make these things stick? Take it, Lewis.
Listen, I was just sitting here. Look, I think it's about focusing on the right priorities. And, you know, we've been doing a piece of work here in Singapore with the government, actually, on learning to learn better, which is, you know, I know an important topic for you, Gordon. And in fact, it's specifically related to what we call skills to build skills. And I think it's very important that we all start to step back and recognize that, you know, the technology that we use and the technical capabilities that we bring to work, be it in leadership and managerial positions or engineering or whatever we do, will always morph and change based on the world around us. But there are fundamental, what we call critical core skills that are important to all of us, being effective with other people, having the sort of cognitive skills that we need to see. One of them is sense making. You know, see those patterns, transdisciplinary thinking, awkward topic, but you know, word, but you know, connecting across things. The last is sort of adaptability and self-management. These things I think we need to pay more attention to, because if we do that, they'll get more baked into the way that we think about, you know, anything that we do in our lives. And I think we should start appreciating those more. So, you know, learning how to learn more effectively, I think, is a very powerful mechanism. So that would be my response.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'll save it to the end because I have a visceral reaction and a very strong agreement to this, but there's dimensions to it that we might want to unfold in the few minutes that we have left. Joan.
Yeah, I don't think we have a choice, right? I mean, so, and you know, stating the obvious here in terms of trying to make it stick, you know, it has, you know, the pandemic has opened up, you know, the gap, the disparity that we have. And I think, you know, 20 years ago, maybe you could cover things up, right? The fact that there are gaps in coverages and whatnot. But now that you've got where you are today, and I think, you know, to a number of the participants or the speakers here, the fact that everything is out in the open, right? I mean, people's voices aren't going to be silenced. And so therefore they will make their voices heard. The fact that there is disparity in gaps, there is disparity in skill set, in learning, you know, and whatnot. So I don't think that there is a choice anymore. It will have to stick because it will, you know, how do we then prepare for the next crisis or the next, you know, big thing that's going to hit us, or the little thing that's going to hit us, to Charlie's point or to Mike's point. So I don't think that there is any more choices. It's either you do this or you will not survive. You will not have an organization, you know, to manage or to lead on a go forward basis. So that's my point. I don't think that you have a choice.
Okay. Who wants to take it next?
I'm happy to. I mean, I certainly hope that's true, but I'm less certain at a societal level this will definitely stick. I think in terms of how we do that, I mean, we've talked about multi-stakeholder capitalism, about the resilience to exponential change, about making the mega trends matter, and I think all of those are important for companies. But I agree with Lewis. I mean, I think we have to prioritize people. The shift that we've seen has really spawned, in many ways, a new breed of company that's much more capable of thriving in uncertainty with that clearer and broader sense of purpose. And the winners, the people that really do well, are going to be the ones that show they can motivate people around that common goal, right? After the crisis, after the health crisis, the economic crisis. And so I think what that means is for leaders to be very intentional. And Rutger talked about this the other day, being very intentional in plotting your course through this with a really strong sense of purpose that you can build solidarity around. And I think without that, everything else will unfortunately fall away.
We are almost done here, almost out of time. Charlie, what's your closing thought here?
I just think we've it's meant to be a synthesis session, and we've got many more questions coming out of it than we had going into it. But maybe that's the meta theme to take away from this, is actually, if you go into a session like this and you come out with more questions, then you've been engaging and thinking about it really very deeply. And because we don't necessarily know the right direction, we know things are happening faster. But we don't necessarily know exactly where we're going to end up, because we need to learn to be ignorant and curious. Perhaps that should always be our aspiration, is to come out of every session with more questions than we have answers.
What a beautiful way to close, guys. I mean, what we have on this last page, the last 5 minutes, we started off talking about how this is a human issue. This is a people issue. And everything that you've described in the last couple of minutes are all about humans and the way that we think and the way that we behave. Focusing on the right priorities means that we have to listen to our people and understand what those priorities are. We need to motivate people around those very clear intentions. We have to be open to having a dialogue and having harder conversations than we've had before, and do it in a transparent way, and prioritize our people all the way through this. So this learning aspect, this learning how to learn and building trust in the way that we're learning together, these are really powerful takeaways. And I'd like to invite our participants to hold these questions for some time. This was one of my favorite pieces of counsel I got from a wonderful teacher for me, a woman named Donna Markova, who was a neurobiologist. And she said, you know what, the best questions, they deserve to stay open. You need to breathe life into them. You don't converge quickly on things that matter this much. And the kinds of questions that we're asking today, I'm inviting our participants to hold dear, hold open, invite people into, and give it the life and time that it deserves. So at this moment, I'm going to invite our participants to hold that question and to answer our poll. So we have a few minutes left, and a poll should be coming up and available to you. And this is an important part of our journey to get your data and to learn from one another. And we want to take this conversation forward with all of the insights that we can get. So with that, thank you so much. It's the bottom of your page right now. Any other final thoughts from you as you close us out here, team?
Maybe one more word from my side. I think we all agree that the only solution we have relies in the competencies of people. So if there's one silver bullet we have, it is developing people. It is education on a society level, and that Joan, you said that for sure organizations have to make profit, but we will have to sacrifice a certain degree of NOI and really invest this into the people of the organization. It may sound simple, in the end, as we all know, being part of a big corporate machine, it is a challenge, but we will have to get on with it.
I wonder if NOI is a very Mercer term, because I saw Joan smile immediately, and the others were like,
a very MMC term.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, let us build the trust that allow for our people to guide us through this together. And let's learn from the powerful women in the world who are doing this really well, and listen and empathize and engage them and mobilize them in ways that we never thought possible. And unlearn our old ways, right? To do the learning moving forward. I think there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do. And I think this is where you started us off, Lewis, and where we're ending right now. Whether it is, what is your term? Rediscover Ignorance.
The Rediscovery of Ignorance, yes. Yeah, amazing.
Well, thank you so much, our esteemed panel. And with that, I wish you all a great morning and evening. And for our participants, hopefully you can hold all of this and hold it for some time. Thank you very much.